Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SSHRC, or Carleton University.
My name is Jane Jensen, and I'm from the Université de Montréal. We're here for the final panel this morning, which has the title Inclusive Growth, Social Innovation, and Social Inclusion. I want to, as many others have done, thank Joan de Bardeleben and the others who have actively organized this conference. And also thank the participants, particularly on my panel, but on the others, who have come to Ottawa for the event. So the panel has agreed that we'll change, though I didn't consult Doug, that we'll change the order of the presentations. So the first speaker will be Doug Murphy, who is the Director General in the Social Policy Directorate of Employment and Social Development Canada. The second presentation will be by Céline Bellot, who is a professor also at the Université of Montréal, but who is here as a representative of our partner organization within the Transatlantic Research Group, the Centre d'études sur la pauvreté et l'exclusion sociale. And finally, Anna Guillén, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Oviedo, but who is here also as a representative of our partner organization, the European Social Observatory. They've changed their name, the Observatory Social Européen, who will talk about Europe. This TRG came into being along with the others because there was a notion that that social policy discussions and even social policy learning could be profitably promoted between Canada and Europe. This was a time when social policy discourse was using a number of key words, which you're going to hear today because they've continued to be important. So keywords like social inclusion, what did I just say? I get them all mixed up. Social cohesion, social inclusion, social exclusion, social investment. At the time when we were working on this, Canada had participated very early in some of the work and some of the thinking about what we call the social investment perspective, which is the sort of modernizing of social policy around notions of investing in human capital, investing in early childhood education, and activation policies. Canada, as I said, had been one of the first countries to begin. The European Union was slowly coming around to actually doing social investment, though it took a while for them to get to announcing that that's what they were doing. But in the social policy domain, there were two events which we've talked about, at least one of them in the first panel this morning, which was the crisis. And the second event was the 2006 election in Canada. And both of those events had profound effects on social policy. For the Canadian side of the story, much of the discussion about modernizing social policy was kind of put on hold or on the back burner or put aside, and other kinds of issues came to the fore. The economic crisis in Europe obviously had profound effects on social policy because of the drive towards austerity, and then the question what to do about the effects of that austerity as they were being felt in not only the most crisis-hit countries, but in all of the European countries. So that the notion of a dialogue and discussion across the Atlantic was somewhat difficult more difficult to sustain in the last years than it had been in the earlier time. One of the places where that discussion did continue, though, was at the provincial level. So, and this is in partly because the Canadian provinces have profound areas of competence for social policy, and so we could see discussions, particularly, I would say, between Quebec and Europe, and also with Ontario and Europe as Ontario moved into its early childhood education reforms. So this was the background to this panel, because another keyword after my social cohesion, social inclusion, social exclusion, social investment, another keyword came onto the agenda, or came into the political discourse, first in Europe, and this was the notion of social innovation. And the Europeans began to spend a lot of time talking about social innovation, by which they meant innovating in the area of the social in ways that we're much more familiar with, in innovations in technology, innovations in economic practices. But it was understood that the social area and social practices could also be innovative. And there you had the discussions of, in a more structured way, discussions of innovations in social policy practices, but also innovations in governance, the involvement of the third sector, the involvement of the communities, the involvement of the cities, the working at the local level. And so this is one of the ways that I think Canada and Europe are starting to reconnect, because for the Canadians in the room, you remember that one of the key words that has been in political discourse over the last few months is also the notion of social innovation, and within that social innovation. So that's why we've asked the panel to talk about these themes, to talk first, as Doug Murphy will do, talk about the Canadian discussions. I asked him to talk about what the government's position was. He says he can't do that, but he'll talk about the discussion around these kinds of issues and where the thinking is moving these days. Céline Bellot will then talk about Quebec's ongoing and long-term concerns with social inclusion in particular, and social exclusion resulting from poverty. And then Anna Guillén will talk about the notions of inclusive growth and social innovation in the European Union. I haven't mentioned inclusive growth, and one of the things I'm interested in hearing from Anna is the way that this notion is used in the European Union, because for any of you who are familiar with the development literature from the Global South, you know that the notion of inclusive growth has entered, among other things, the European vocabulary, I would argue, coming from the discussions about the Global South and how to do growth in an inclusive fashion, so that we've got a set of discussions which are Canada, Europe, that's our mandate, but these are also discussions which are transatlantic, but they're also north-south. And I think that when we talk about these kinds of questions, we need to see them located in a broader set of discussions than simply the ones that go across the Atlantic.
So Jane mentioned a few terms. I'm going to try and do justice to them all in a very brief period of time, but this is from a federal perspective. I think this is social policy at a crossroads. I won't be able to go into maybe as much detail as some people would, but I will be able to say a lot about what the government is committing to do. And what I'd like to do is to look at the trends, the problems that Canada is facing now, and talk about how the government is committing to doing that, both substantively but also in terms of process, which I think is important. So that's kind of the outline of the presentation. I will be getting into data a little bit. I'll try, some of the slides are small, but I'll try and talk to the broad themes. then we'll talk a little bit about the very ambitious social policy agenda that the government has committed to, addressing inclusion, poverty, social innovation, among other things. And then I'll talk a little bit about future work and where we go from here as the Government of Canada. I would like to start off by saying that I'm talking about federal approaches. As Jane mentioned, Canada is a federation where provinces and territories play a very, very important role. And many of the initiatives I talk about will be done in partnership with provinces and territories. So I'll begin by talking about some of the key trends and what are the challenges that we face. And we face a number of social challenges. Poverty, when you talk about social inclusion, poverty is probably the most top of mind. And what this slide is really doing, on the one hand, you see a black line that descends dramatically. That's the seniors' poverty rate in Canada. There's been a strong government intervention going back many years, the old age security and the guaranteed income supplement. It shows what public policy can do in terms of really driving a vast improvement in poverty. When you look at the other lines, you see them going up and down. Those are the working age populations. And what they're doing is they're tracking the business cycle. So we see for seniors, for families, for unattached individuals, they go up, they go down with the business cycle, but they seem to be stuck at around 10%. Now for children, for the child poverty rate, it's come down a bit through a large part by provinces and territories working together and injecting vast amounts of money into the child benefit system. Also in the case of many provinces, Quebec most notably, there's a very mature childcare system. But we kind of see, or we certainly see a plateau or a level of poverty that even during periods of strong economic growth and prolonged economic growth, it's hard to get that low income rate down below that. I've been talking about the low income rate in any one year, and for many, many people, low income is transitory. What we really have to be concerned about is low income over time, because when you get persistent low income, that's when you start to get scarring effects. You can only imagine for children, if they're living in low income for 4 out of 6 years, 5 out of 6 years, 6 out of 6 years, what effects that will have on their development. And when we look at this phenomena of persistent low income, there are various subpopulations that are always at risk. And this has not changed over the last 15 to 20 years. So we see lone parents, we see recent immigrants, Aboriginal people living off reserve. That's not to say that Aboriginal people living on reserve are doing better, but that's the limitations of our data. People with disabilities. So the gray bar there shows the incidence of living in poverty in any one year. The reddish number shows persistent low income. And that's where the lived experience of poverty becomes pretty dramatic if you've been living there for 4 or 5 years. When we look at the labor market, it's interesting because there's no official definition of working poverty in Canada, but we've come up with a definition in our department that looks at people that work a number of hours, so that they're almost working full-time, yet they're still not able to escape low income. And we use that metric. Over 3% of people, despite strong work attachment, cannot escape living in low income. Income inequality. So this is an issue that I know has captured the imagination of social policy thinkers and of ordinary citizens all over the world, because if there's anything that's happening, converging, it's a rise in income inequality. In the Canadian context, we see that income inequality rose dramatically from the mid-1990s. it seemed to have hit a plateau around the year 2000 and has more or less stayed the same, but it's at a much higher level than it was previously. And it's important to note that this has been really driven by market income inequality, so earnings primarily, taking off in a very unequal fashion. And there are many theories as for why income inequality is taking off throughout the developed world. There's technological change, there's globalization. I think these all play an important factor. So you can see that when you look at various income components, so various quintiles, as we say, you can see the top taking off, and then you can see very, very flat growth, if at all, for the other income quintiles. So it's income inequality is an issue that Canada faces, as do many other developed countries. One thing in Canada that we've been very proud of, I think, is that we have a high degree of social mobility. So in this instance, we talk of intergenerational social mobility, this being the sense that a parent's income does not preordain, or it's not a very good predictor of the income of the child. And this is an area where Canada has rivaled Nordic countries, and it's been in stark contrast to many other countries, with the United Kingdom, Brazil, the United States. A parent's income predicts about 50% of a child's income. In Canada, you can see there, it's on the vertical axis. You can see that it's around 20.26%, which is pretty good when you look at other countries. But Canada's always been a bit of an outlier, because the pattern, and Miles Korak, who's a professor at University of Ottawa, he's done a lot of work in this area. He's coined a phrase, a Gatsby curve. And the Gatsby curve is a correlation between high income inequality and low social mobility. And for a long period of time, Canada was able to buck that trend. So we had relatively high income inequality, but our social mobility was very high. What we've been doing is trying to track whether this increase in income inequality that I talked about is having some negative effects on social mobility. Because this is a long period of time, we don't have all the results yet, but when we look at kind of manageable chunks of people moving up, we are noticing people getting stuck. So it's worrisome. We don't have the definitive data yet, but I think there's reason to monitor their situation, because the whole notion of Canada being a country of opportunity, I think, was something that many social policy thinkers were very, very proud of, and educators, and I think we really want to maintain that strong performance. Jane talked about the importance of social investment, human capital, particularly during the early years. Childcare, of course, is very important for early learning and childcare. It also is important in terms of labor force participation of parents. This is a pretty obvious area of social investment, and as I'll allude to later, it's an area where the government will be getting back into business after a period of time where they chose a different policy instrument than childcare. And it is a factor. I mean, Quebec is a shining star. We have other provinces that are doing very well in terms of childcare, but when you look at the Federation and the country, there are shortages throughout. Another area when we're looking at social inclusion, social investment, the experience of poverty that is really, really profound is, of course, housing, and I would add housing and homelessness. This is a tough climate. It's not great to be homeless in most of Canada. In terms of housing, affordable housing is an issue. I mean, there are real estate markets in Canada where it's virtually impossible to find affordable rental housing. I mean, Vancouver, Toronto are the obvious examples. Okay, so I've described a whole bunch of problems, but I would like to describe what the government has committed to do in response to those challenges. And one thing that the government has done is to commit to a poverty reduction strategy. And this would align with what provinces and territories are doing because, quite frankly, Canada at the federal level is coming very late to this game. Every province and territory, save one or two, has a poverty reduction strategy. Quebec, going back many, many years. The government has committed to developing a poverty reduction strategy, and one with targets, and one with regular reporting. And that is something that is important to ensure continued support and continued attention to that. I talked about childcare and the government getting back into that field. And of course, we'll be working with provinces and territories on that. But we will be engaging in a consultation and engagement with provinces and territories and Indigenous communities to develop a new early learning and childcare framework, to take that social investment aspect and drive that forward. Social infrastructure has been a major area of focus recently. So the infrastructure nomenclature with social in front. We are planning large investments in housing, in childcare, in cultural and recreational activities. And this has a dual purpose. Of course, it's to increase the social infrastructure in Canada, but it also has a stimulative effect for the economy, which is important at this juncture. In terms of other things, Jane spoke about social innovation, and this has been an area where the government has attached quite a bit of importance. And when I spoke about those vulnerable groups and the persistence of them living in low income for a period of time, so it is the same groups. If I were giving this presentation 15 years ago, I would have shown a graph with exactly the same groups. And it's not without traditional government investments in those areas. The former government, the current government recognize this issue. They put targeted programs in for the vulnerable groups, people with disabilities, recent immigrants, lone parents. Yet the low income rate persists. So the whole area of social innovation, I think, is ripe for trying to tackle these very persistent social problems. I think we need to use the big levers that we have, but I think we also have to be very open to experimentation because the historical approach does not seem to be making enough progress. Because it would be nice to show a chart like that in the future where those differences are largely erased. The mandate letter had a number of commitments related to the broad area of social finance, social inclusion, but I guess kind of the headline announcement is the government will be doing an entire strategy on social finance and social innovation, which I know is very exciting for a number of people and a number of stakeholders in that area. There's some underlying principles that have been revealed, I think, sometimes explicitly articulated, sometimes just revealed from the new government. One is a commitment to middle-class prosperity. Again, a focus on income inequality. So recognition that the top taking off is a challenge for Canadian society. Federal, provincial, territorial collaboration and partnership. Again, this is to recognize that we need to respect each other's jurisdictions, but we're in this together. A renewal of relationships with Indigenous people, including nation-to-nation cooperation. So I spoke about nation-to-nation consultation or engagement on early learning and childcare. It will be the same thing when we do a poverty reduction strategy. The final thing is the importance of evidence experimentation and measurement. We're seeing differences and a new emphasis on that. Of course, the long-form census has been reinstated. I was at a 2-day conference yesterday on behavioral economics, bringing in academics, provincial and municipal, civil servants. We had my minister, Jean-Yves Duclos, do the closing ceremony. It was really about, working collaboratively on evidence-based policy. So that was very refreshing. A little bit more about social innovation. The government is already doing a lot of things, so we do have the strategy, but we are trying to attack many of these wicked problems, these persistent problems, through a variety of innovative approaches. There's leveraging and matching, there's pay for performance, social finance, including social impact bonds, and the social enterprise business model. So this is an area where, yes, we are developing a strategy, but I know my colleagues are working very hard in terms of trying to innovate socially to address some of those long-lasting problems. Future work, well, in a word, it's all about engagement at this point. So we will be in listening mode. We will be having structured consultations, engagements on 3 of the big initiatives that I mentioned: a Canadian poverty reduction strategy, the social innovation and social finance strategy, and the national early learning and childcare framework. And thank you.